Now we will see the glossopharyngeal nerve. We have motor pathway and sensory pathway. So remember that a cranial nerve has motor and sensory pathway. Let's review a spinal nerve first. We have anterior and posterior horns. Here is the lower motor neuron, here is the dorsal root ganglion, this is the dendritic process, and at the end they join here. So this is a peripheral nerve. We can say that the peripheral nerve has the axon of this lower motor neuron, so axon for the motor, and for the sensory pathway is a dendrite. But also, here we have pain and temperature sensation, in which the first synapse is the substance of Rolandus, or if this is a neuron that goes in the pathway of proprioception, then it will ascend, and in the nucleus of gracilis or cuneatus will have the first synapse. So here the motor pathway, the peripheral nerve begins, you can think it as here in the anterior horn for the motor pathway, and for the sensory pathway you can think that it begins or on the substantia gelatinous substance of Rolandus or on the nucleus of gracilis or cuneatus, because the peripheral nerve includes or is formed by all the first neuron or all the first order neuron of the sensory pathway, that is axon, dorsal root ganglion, and dendritic process, and the first or the lower motor neuron, that is the body and the axon. So this is a peripheral nerve. So now for the glossopharyngeus, we have motor and sensory pathway. So for the motor, remember we have the upper motor neuron, as well as here we have a upper motor neuron. But this is not part of a spinal nerve. This upper motor neuron is not going to be part of the glossopharyngeal nerve. So we have this upper motor neuron that will descend in the medulla, and here will synapse on this ambiguous nucleus. The ambiguous nucleus is for motor. Ambiguous motor, and then we have three other sites of the body of the neuron for the sensory pathway. So we are seeing like kind of this analog, but for the glossopharyngeal nerve. So this now will be the lower motor neuron that will innervate the stylopharyngeus muscle that elevates the tongue when we swallow. So this is the motor. The only motor muscle innervated by the glossopharyngeal nerve is the stylopharyngeus muscle, and we have the lower motor neuron. The lower motor neuron is the one that is called the glossopharyngeal nerve for the motor part. And now let's see the sensory part. We have the sensation from the pharynx, mucus of the pharynx, as well as the middle ear, the posterior third of the tongue, either sensation and gustatory papials, tongue, the external ear. Now this sensation is coming, we have the dendritic process. Here is the dendrite. Well, here we have the dendritic process that is sensing the tongue or the pharynx, mucosa of the pharynx, etc. So these are the dendritic processes. The body of these neurons lie for this on the inferior ganglion of the glossopharyngeal nerve. So let's say on this ganglion. Here I'm not putting very much the anatomical relation, because I draw often, but I want to put the concept. So this is the inferior glossopharyngeal ganglion. Then from here it projects to the nucleus of the tractus solitarius. So nucleus of the tractus solitarius. And then we enter to the spinal cord. Let me put it. Here was this was my medulla, so the spinal cord is here. So we have this sensation from the pharynx, and we have the ganglion, the inferior glossopharyngeal ganglion. Is ganglion because it's outside the central nervous system. Then this is the tract of the solitary nucleus, because the synapse occurs on the solitary nucleus on the spinal cord, and then it ascends or descends to the ventroposteromedial nucleus of the thalamus, as well as for the hypothalamus. So this pathway is the taste pathway that we have seen in other video. Here the important thing is the sensory part. This is the dendritic process, this is the ganglion, the bodies of these neurons, and this is the axon. So from here to here is the glossopharyngeal nerve. So before the nucleus of the tractus solitarius, and the tractus of the nucleus solitarius is the glossopharyngeal nerve, or part of the glossopharyngeal nerve. You remember that the classification of a cranial nerve is like a broad classification, is not a specific classification, but I think that it was very clear like this, how we are applying it here. The other is the external ear. Here we have the sensation of the external ear, but the bodies of these first of these neurons are on the superior glossopharyngeal ganglion, and then they ascend again to the nucleus of the tractus solitarius. They go to the spinal nucleus of the trigeminus. So this is kind of pain and temperature sensation for the external ear, because here we are at the spinal nucleus of the trigeminus, then the trigeminus continues and is the pain and temperature sensation, then is the fibers here. Now let's see the spinal nucleus of the trigeminus. Remember, we have the trigeminal ganglion. Well, from here it descends by the trigeminospinal tract, then this crosses to the other side, ascend, ventral lemniscus. Anyway, here the spinal nucleus of the trigeminus is also receiving information from the superior ganglion of the glossopharyngeal nerve that contains the sensation for the external ear. We will see a video of the sensation of the ear and around there. Anyway, so we have seen two sensory pathways, the motor pathway and now the parasympathetic pathway. Here, remember parasympathetic, we have a preganglionic neuron, ganglion, postganglionic neuron, and the target organ. The preganglionic neuron, the body of this preganglionic neuron lies on the inferior superior salivary nucleus. Well, let me put it here, in the salivary nucleus. Then we have glossopharyngeal nerve. This is glossopharyngeal nerve. Then the ganglion is called the otic ganglion, and then the postganglionic neuron innervates the parotid gland. So here, this first order neuron, or this preganglionic neuron, is the glossopharyngeal nerve. So the glossopharyngeal nerve has motor innervation to the stylopharyngeal muscle, that the body of this first neuron, so you can think as the pathway begins in the cortex, then the upper motor neuron synapse in the nucleus ambiguous, and here begins the glossopharyngeal nerve. Then for sensory pathway, we have either from the inferior or superior glossopharyngeal ganglion, depending on which sensation we have. If it is pharynx, middle ear, tongue, etc., then it goes to the nucleus of the tractus solitarius by the tractus of the nucleus solitarius, and then it ascends to the dorsomedial nucleus of the thalamus, hypothalamus, etc. Or if we're coming from the external ear, the synapse will occur at the spinal nucleus of the trigeminus. and then at the end to the ventroposteromedial nucleus of the thalamus, and somatosensory cortex on the parietal lobe. And innervation to the parotid gland. The first neuron is on the salivary nucleus. And from there, in the glossopharyngeal nerve, that synapse on the optic ganglion and then innervates the parotid gland. So this is the glossopharyngeal nerve.